So welcome everyone to the MITEI Energy Series. You can see our title of our talk today up behind me. My name is Bill Green. I'm a professor of chemical engineering and I'm the director of the MIT Energy Initiative. The Energy Initiative runs a series of talks throughout the year on how we can make the energy transition move more rapidly with the urgency that's needed to deal with the climate problem. Every April, in honor of Earth Day, we always try to find a leading environmentalist or person from an environmental organization to come to MIT as part of this talk series. And so today I'm very pleased to introduce Manish Bapna. He's the president and CEO of the Natural Resources Defense Council, one of the most famous and long duration environmental nonprofit groups in the world. Manish earned his degree here at MIT in electrical engineering, though before this building was built. And maybe he can tell you about that a little bit, where he was. He worked for a while for the World Bank, and then worked for a long time for the World Resources Institute as the managing director and executive vice president, and had a lot to do with the growth of that organization. Since 2021, he's been the leader of the Natural Resources Defense Council. And so I'm very pleased to welcome Manish Bapna.
Great, thank you.
So maybe you can start and just tell us a little bit what's on your mind.
Well, first, it's great to be here. I came here, I was a class of 91. I was a terrible engineer. I bounced around 7 or 8 different majors. I think 6-1 was what I ended up landing on, and but I always thought of MIT as just an incredibly special place. And I was here yesterday, today. One of the things I do in my job is raise money, so a lot of meetings with donors. But I had a little time last night, and I was walking along the Infinite Corridor. And it just dawned on me, one of the things that makes MIT so special is not just the extraordinary excellence in all these different departments and disciplines, but it is the connections between those disciplines where I think some of the most creative work kind of takes place. And the Infinite Corridor, and kind of just visually, like I hadn't thought about the Infinite Corridor in that way, and yet that connection to so many different parts of the organization just really struck me. I remember since I was scared about doing my senior thesis in engineering, so I actually was able to do my thesis on higher education in engineering, and how do you actually think about embedding kind of social values in an engineering education. And that was warmly received, right, at MIT. And I think that is what makes this place special. Things like the Energy Initiative that bring the best of what MIT has to offer on energy in different places. And that is what is so brilliant about the place. After MIT, I was in the PhD program here for a moment. And then I went to work in consulting for a couple of years at Oliver Wyman and Company. And then I went to a PhD program at Harvard for a moment. And then I dropped out of that and did a couple of degrees at Harvard. Then I went to the World Bank. Really was interested in poverty and inequality issues. Like, that's what motivated me. So I spent 7-8 years at the World Bank, but then made a pretty big pivot. I went from the World Bank to a small human rights organization, and to WRI, the World Resources Institute, and then to the Natural Resources Defense Council. And a couple of things kind of motivated that pivot from the World Bank to kind of the environmental nonprofit kind of civil society space. One was, I felt if you really wanted to tackle poverty and inequality globally, you couldn't separate that from issues of sustainability, right? Whether it's productivity of land, accessible clean water, energy, climate change. And I also felt for me that the World Bank was working kind of within the system. And if you actually wanted to think creatively about what it would take to solve the biodiversity crisis, the climate crisis, the human health crises, you got to think a little bit more about how to change the system, and that there was more space in smaller organizations to do that. And so that's how I ended up at NRDC.
Wow, so interesting. So all you students in the audience, you're pursuing whatever your degree is right now, but just remember, you don't know where you're going, and you might end up running Natural Resources Defense Council someday.
Not what I had anticipated, right? It's so true.
Yeah. So maybe, this is quite a moment. I was thinking, like, just this week, all of the authors of the U.S. National Climate Assessment were fired, which is something I never expected to happen in my lifetime.
Yeah.
And it did make me think, like, wow, we're really at a moment with the environmental challenge. And I think that firing maybe reflects an unwillingness to even acknowledge a problem, because if you acknowledge the problem exists, then you have to start thinking about solutions. Now, of course, at MIT, that's all we love to do. Is we love to find problems because we can work in solutions, because that's we're all a bunch of engineers. But I was wondering, from the point of view of the environmental community, how do you think, how do we find a solution here?
So it's a great question, and it might be worth just for me to take a couple of minutes, and to me this conversation more colloquially would be, what the hell's going on in Washington and what do we do about it, which feels like at least it's top of mind for me and perhaps for others as well. It probably worth just taking one step back and thinking a little bit about what was done on climate and energy policy under the Biden administration, right? It was a unprecedented moment in terms of progress on clean energy and climate policy. When the Biden administration came into power, into office, U.S. greenhouse gas emissions were trending to about 30% below 2005 levels by 2030, right? And the science would say it should have gone further, but the reality was what would be a bold goal that the U.S. could adopt. And President Biden put forward this goal of 50 to 52% below 2005 levels by 2030. A pretty significant shift, right, in the curve. And then the question is, how were they going to get there? And how many of you remember the Waxman-Markey cap and trade bill, right? We all, it wasn't going to happen politically, right? And we can get back to cap and trade and carbon pricing, the prospects of that in Washington. But there wasn't real appetite for that. The thing that I think the president and the administration and Congress, quite frankly, Congress really took the lead in this, even though the administration gets credit, is trying to design a bill for the moment. And so they really embraced a set of kind of green industrial policy, right? A set of incentives to encourage adoption of clean energy technologies. And so the big thing that they did in 2022 is, of course, the Inflation Reduction Act. And the Inflation Reduction Act, if anything, is underestimated in terms of what it actually may do. It was billed as a $370 billion program. It actually is probably $1 trillion program, and there's reason why it was scored that way and what it actually would do. It was a mix of, a small amount on direct federal funding, a big amount in tax credits. It covered much of the economy, the power sector, transportation, advanced manufacturing, wide range of technologies, energy efficiency, resilience investments. But it also was quite brilliant in that a lot of the benefits would actually accrue across the United States. Once up and running, if you look at what has happened so far, 80% of the investments and jobs from the Inflation Reduction Act actually are accruing, are being channeled to red districts or red states. So you think about what that means, and it comes back to the question you asked. So So big thing they did was around the Inflation Reduction Act. The other part of it, so it was a set of carrots. The other part of it was kind of the regulatory side, federal rules and standards. You wouldn't get the curve, the pivot in the decarbonization curve just with carrots alone. That got you, let's say, from 30%. The modeling would say you got to 40% with the carrots. But if you wanted to get to 50%, you got to have a little bit of the sticks. And so there were these big rules that were passed around power plants, around vehicles, around methane, around appliance efficiency standards, a wide range of rules. And so you had that mix of carrots and sticks that didn't get you all the way to 50, but the modeling said would it get you to 45, 47. It was a very big thing. And then the elections happened, right? And it is truly, it is hard to overstate how quickly the shift in Washington in terms of policy has taken place, right? So you have not only the Inflation Reduction Act right now, and we can get into this a bit more if of interest, but it's right now in the crosshairs of a reconciliation bill. You all are following the conversation around extending the Trump tax cuts and that work. And one of the big things that is being discussed in Washington is how will this be paid for? And one of the big questions is, well, can we get some money out of this Inflation Reduction Act? And there's a debate now between, are they going to whole-scale repeal it, take a sledgehammer to it, or are they going to kind of, be more surgical and cut pieces of it out? So this sledgehammer versus scalpel approach is kind of very live question in Washington. On the rules, now this administration largely is not only trying to repeal the rules, but is actually trying to undercut the very foundations on what these rules are actually built on. There are two things that are particularly noteworthy beyond the individual rules. Something called the endangerment finding. Has anyone heard of the endangerment finding? This is a very informed crowd, I know, that knows more than I do on these things. But the endangerment finding was basically a finding that greenhouse gas emissions are a pollutant and can be regulated. So they want to challenge that, and they want to challenge the ability of states, such as California, to set more stringent pollution rules. So there's some real issues at play on that side. And on top of that, now coming back to the National Climate Assessment, it's not only repeal of the rules or the foundation of the rules, they're gutting the very institutions that are needed. And that is truly problematic, because we know that if they actually gut the institutions, it's going to take a lot more time to rebuild those institutions at a point in time when there is a will to do so. And so this point around the National Climate Assessment is just another indication of how it's not just kind of what we saw in the first Trump administration. It is a more full-scale assault on the institutions themselves. I know sounds like a terribly cynical story, but like clear-eyed about what we're facing, but there's still a lot that can be done.
Wow, tell us what can be done.
Let me start with the kind of the community, the Natural Resources Defense Council, the broader climate community. What are we doing kind of in this moment? And I'll just kind of stay high level, and then we can dig into what might be of most interest. The first thing is that the courts still matter. Litigation is an incredibly important tool in this moment. In the first Trump administration, NRDC took the administration to court 163 times, once every 10 days. We won 88% of the cases, right? We thought this time around the courts have shifted to the right. We thought they would be smarter, they wouldn't make the same mistakes. What we're finding is actually their desire to have a flood the zone strategy, gutting the agencies, means they're actually quite sloppy. And even in this kind of judicial environment that we find ourselves in, when you approach court cases or litigation not through an ideological lens, but through a procedural lens, you could still win. The last 10 cases we took to an appellate court, as you know, it's District Appellate Supreme, the appellate courts, with Trump-appointed judges, we won 8 out of those 10 cases. So it gives you confidence that at this moment in time, the courts, by and large, are still holding for small to medium things. The big question is the Supreme Court and what happens if the administration doesn't adhere to what the courts say, what everyone is talking about, the constitutional crisis, right? That we can come back to that. That is a real question, and we can get into that. But at this moment, for at least climate and energy policy, the courts are the first line of defense. The second piece is that Congress still matters, and the majorities, as you know, in Congress are slim. In the House, it's 3-4 votes. In the Senate, you know, John Thune has committed that he was not going to let go of the filibuster, so you need 60 votes. The Democrats have 53, right? So you have that kind of reality. The big thing when we talk to people on the Hill is that you're starting to see some cracks on the Republican side on energy and climate policy. It is going to be almost directly correlated to the president's favorability ratings. When his favorability ratings are 48, 50, 52%, very little cracks are going to emerge. Now, many of you know it's kind of down to 44, 45%. When it gets down to the 40, 41, 42%, my sense is you're going to see a lot more at play. So one of the big things, you know, is both to work Congress to look at and to remind people the story is that, you know, this isn't about, this is about affordable, reliable, clean energy. And quite frankly, a lot of that, reliable, affordable energy, and a lot of that is actually clean. And a lot of these investments are happening in red districts and red states. And so these members of Congress who are at the ribbon-cutting ceremonies for new manufacturing plants in their districts, are they going to actually be willing to repeal things that their people are benefiting from? So part of it is about telling that story. And then a big part of what we need to do in Congress is also depoliticize climate policy. The worst thing that has happened in the past 5-10 years is how politicized energy and climate policy has become in this country. And we need to find a way to move beyond that, and we can get into that. But so the second piece is Congress. The third is, remember, the United States is much bigger than just what happens in Washington, D.C. And what's happening at the state level, there's some good stories at the state level. And it's not only blue states like California and New York and people you would expect to Massachusetts that you would expect to do interesting things. States in the Midwest, states in the Southeast that are often the biggest beneficiaries of clean energy investments have a stake. And so we're seeing some interesting commitments, some interesting movement at the state level. And even with companies, and although the companies in terms of the rhetoric have gone soft in a really troubling way, many of them still want reliable, affordable energy. And they know that a clean energy, a solar and storage, can be built faster than natural gas. And if you're a hyperscaler trying to invest in a data center or an AI center, what you want is you want electricity as quickly as possible. You're actually not that price sensitive because energy costs are such a small part of your investments. You just want something built that you can feel good about, that you can rely on. And that is what they're, you know, that is, so you could actually do things there. And the final point I would make is that not only is the U.S. more than what happens in Washington, the world is much bigger than what happens in the United States, right? The United States is 12% of emissions. China's 35, India's 8 and growing, right? So what's quite interesting as well is what's happening in other countries. countries are not walking away from climate because the U.S. is walking away from climate. 8 years ago when Trump was in office the first time, there was a big question: would the Paris Agreement hold? Would that forward progress be made? The world is in a different place today. The economics are profoundly different today than they were a decade ago. And that should be reassuring. I mean, we want the United States to be leading in part of that. But for those that want to solve climate, what other countries do matters. And, I just got back from both Beijing and Delhi in the last 6 weeks. And I can tell you that these countries, and we can get into that a bit more, they're still moving forward.
Well, thank you for the positive angle there. I was struck thinking about the Biden administration policies, that they passed a lot of incentives and a lot of regulations, but not that much got built, or at least not yet. And I think that maybe part of what they ran into was the whole regulatory regime, permitting kind of problems that have kind of accreted over the years in this country since the time when you and I were kids, I guess.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, if you have a comment about that, because I guess NRDC is probably on both sides of this issue.
We are. So who here, I suspect the answer will be a lot. Raise your hand if you're know about reading or have an opinion on Ezra Klein's Abundance book. This comment that Bill made is so timely and topical right now. And the argument is that we have made it too complicated. Some of us, the left, has made it too difficult to build things in America. And you think about the various permitting regime, the complexities around getting permits to build stuff, right? And what we need, and there is truth to that, right? I think, and so there's a very big debate about, within kind of a lot of the kind of intellectual circles of the Democratic Party about it can't be just, so this is a C4, this is a political conversation. I'm wearing my NRDC Action Fund hat, not my NRDC hat as we veer into politics, just to state that to be proper. But there is a kind of view that the Democratic Party can't only be against something. What is the Democratic Party for? And can the Democratic Party be about a positive vision about building a better future? And that plays out in the energy space where there's been a lot of the environmental movement historically has been about how to stop things from getting built. But 30 years ago, that may have made sense. Today, the way we're going to solve these problems is not by stopping, stuff that we don't like from getting built, but it's actually how do you build good stuff fast, right? And so that is a very important kind of inflection point for the environmental movement, is how do you get behind building clean energy, for example, fast? How can we expedite permitting and transmission build-out for clean energy? Those are very topical questions and things that I think you're right, the environmental community is in both places on, and we need to kind of find a way to articulate a more coherent position on.
And we had the congressional staff come here for an energy training last week. And I felt extremely positive out of that. We had about equal numbers of staff from the Democrats and Republicans all over the country. And almost every single one of them was completely engaged. They listened to the boring MIT professors drone on, and they stayed awake. They asked good questions. They were really impressive congressional staff, I have to say. I was very impressed. And they were pretty confident that actually this Congress is going to do some things. And one of the things that potentially they're going to do is do something about permitting and transmission lines and stuff. But I felt that they didn't really know what yet, and they were kind of interested to hear what MIT professors thought about it. I don't know how your feeling is.
It's a complicated political. So we need permitting reform. We need transmission build-out. Absolutely, right? And I would even make the argument that on a level playing field, clean energy more often than not is going to win. The problem is, in my mind, the Trump administration right now is not about a level playing field or all of the above. Like the historical conservative approach is tech neutral, all of the above approach, and let the market decide. This is clearly a put your thumb on the scale for fossil. You probably saw just about a week and a half ago, the Department of Interior is now going to expedite permitting for coal, oil, gas, and nuclear, but not clean. There was a order a couple weeks ago to ask FERC to integrate fossil energy more effectively. Like everything is clearly and to impede wind, particularly offshore wind, right? Which the president has a historical problem with because of his golf course in Scotland. So I do think that the challenge, I think, on permitting and transmission reform, we need it, but in this Congress, I'm worried that what is likely to happen is stripping out protections for local communities, and it'll be biased towards fossil energy. And I think the interesting thing in my mind is if you actually had a level playing field, my sense is clean energy would actually win out more often than not. Whether or not you could get good permitting and transmission legislation in this Congress, I think is not impossible, but it's implausible. Doesn't mean we won't try if we can see it, but you would need to get 60 votes in the Senate, so we feel a little bit of comfort that there would be some protection against perhaps the most egregious negative aspects of a permitting.
And I guess Trump has to sign whatever the bill is at the end, so that's always
an open question.
Yeah. Maybe you take some questions from the audience. Anyone have? Yeah.
Okay, I'm likely to flub what I'm.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, microphone so everybody can hear.
Okay. So I'm an alum. I'm really grateful to be here. Luckily I live in the area, so that's nice. I'm in offshore wind myself, so devoted professionally to clean energy. I'm hearing plenty of positive goals about clean energy and transmission. I totally support them. The question is the realism and the practicality in a political environment. So as I see it, I'm getting to my question shortly. As I see it, the strategy of electrifying everything, which kind of underlies the IRA, was never really a guaranteed solution, in my view. It was a hopeful solution. But if you look at at projected trends 5 years ago, 3 years ago, 1 year ago, whatever, before Trump, they were not getting us to net zero by 2050.
Right.
Okay.
Yep.
So this gets to my question now. There are, I think, other very promising solutions which I feel like are being totally ignored. They would address the political issues, perhaps. And the one that's topmost on my mind is this green fuel called ammonia, green ammonia made by wind farms and solar farms, where you make it thousands of miles away, where there's no politics, where maybe you don't need a permit, where you don't need transmission lines, and then any individual community or building could be purchasing this for their heat, for their electricity, and so on. It seems like that's a reasonable way to overcome federal opposition and NIMBY politics, because there's an established regime of transporting, storing ammonia. And my question is sort of like why this doesn't get discussed. It seems like really promising. Some countries are getting into it,
right.
But entities in the U.S. and the panel on climate change, whatever, they don't mention it, and I don't know why. That's my question.
So I would agree with the observation that even pre-election, we were not on a credible path to net zero. I would agree that, in my mind, given the counterfactual of climate change and recognizing that quite interestingly, what the planet is doing in response to a certain given level of emissions, its response to that has been more violent than what had been projected. The urgency is real. I would also agree that we can't take anything that is credible off the table. So enhanced geothermal, nuclear, right? Carbon dioxide removal technologies, green hydrogen, right? I actually think we have to be open to looking at as many things as is possible. I wish I knew, I don't know enough about green ammonia to give you an informed response. I know our team, but we have a lot of people, so I can come back to you. I do think there's an open question that I believe is around cost. And so that's the one question. I think one of the things that we have to think about is how to get the cost structure. I mean, there are certain technologies now that are increasingly in the money, right? And I know I heard a previous MITEI lecture where Brian Deese said it's time to take the training wheels off of those technologies. That's absolutely right. And at the same time, there are other technologies that need more investment, innovation for deployment at scale. We need to understand where technologies are in the deployment kind of life cycle. But I need to get back to you on ammonia. I thought the issue was cost, but I'm not.
So I would like to add the final sentence.
Yeah, please.
No, it's very low cost if you go where the renewables are extremely
Cheap. Yeah.
Like 1 cent a kilowatt hour Saudi
Right.
Arabian sunshine,
Right.
solar electricity,
Right.
which makes a fuel shipped to the U.S. which is competitive with fossil fuels.
Right.
So it's that kind of thinking.
Yep.
And I feel like whatever benefits people have seen in green hydrogen, I'm not sure that can deliver because of the storage costs.
Right.
I think the green ammonia does that
Does
very
offer.
good job.
We have people looking at that. I just don't want to
Thank
pretend that
you.
I know more than I do.
Over on the right, Susan?
Thank you for a wonderful discussion. I want to come back to your comment about the global situation and the Paris Agreement.
Yeah.
I certainly agree that other countries are moving forward, like China and the EU. My concern with the U.S. getting out is going to be the way that the financial support for other developing countries goes. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. So one just useful starting point to keep in mind is even when we say the economics of clean energy are favorable, many clean energy technologies tend to be more capital intensive. So financing can be a problem. You think of an EV, right? Over 7 or 10 years, your EV is cheaper than your internal combustion engine car. But the EV is going to cost you $10,000 more today. So if you don't have access to cheap financing, it's going to be hard to make that purchase. And there are then certain types of investments that don't have a return. If you think about investments in resilience or adaptation, many of them don't have an obvious market return. And in a world where the United States still, on a historical basis, is largest by far cumulative emissions, right? There is a certain obligation in my mind that rich countries have to support developing countries in financing the transition. The big thing from the last COP, the international kind of UNFCCC convention conversation, was a big finance deal, both public and private money that would be used to support countries in making the shift. And the problem that you're raising rightfully is that, the United States is still, the richest large country in the world. And by withdrawing all that finance, how do we finance the transition? How do we support countries making that transition? Part of the, and I'm not sure there is a great answer to that question, because the typical idea is, okay, go to the Europeans because, if, they try to do the right thing sometimes. But right now, with everything happening around NATO and defense, they're cutting their aid budgets. So they're withdrawing, right? Then you go to countries that aren't contributing money, and will they contribute money? That's tough, right? Will you go to the Middle Eastern countries? Will you go to Korea? Will you get Japan to do more? Will China step in? Well, China is stepping in, but in their own way, right? But not in a way that would actually kind of replace the lost climate finance from the rich world. One of the areas that's going to be useful to look at is one of the big sources of international climate finance is the multilateral development banking system. Huge amount of capital that they can actually catalyze, mobilize, and channel to these countries. And one of the big open questions will be, will the Trump administration try to muck up their ability to do that or not? That is going to be a huge part of the answer to your question about how bad the damage will be, is whether or not the MDBs have space to continue to increase climate finance to these countries that will need it to support them in their mitigation and resilience efforts.
So you must know locally we have a finance problem with the offshore wind in Massachusetts. Basically that the contracts were let and then the interest rates changed and a lot of the companies then couldn't make the numbers work, and our system of how to adapt to the changed circumstances is not that nimble, I would guess. That's maybe the way to say it. So everything that happens with Massachusetts offshore wind makes things more delayed. And we've had many decades of that. You mentioned the Trump administration coming in and putting their thumb on the scale sometimes. So that just happened recently in New York State, where one of the oil companies, Equinor, the oil and gas company from Norway, also is a really big offshore wind developer and had the contract to build a gigantic offshore wind farm for New York. And they're very unhappy because now they're being blocked by the Trump administration, even though they're building a special port in Brooklyn, and they contracted with factories actually in Massachusetts to make some stuff. And there's actually GE Vernova was involved in some deals, and everybody's now thinking like this is not going to happen, and lay off all the workers. I don't know what's going to happen. This interplay between the finance problem and the permitting challenge, again, to a poor engineer like me, it seems like, what's wrong with the humans? We can't get this straight. I don't know. Maybe from your angle, you can see it differently.
No. I mean, I think the wind industry was already challenged, as we know, before the elections, and some folks can speak to that even better than I can, and is further headwinds post-election. But in addition, the other thing I would just say about financing is interest rates. Interest rates matter for clean energy deployment. And, so what is happening with the tariffs, what is happening with the deficits, what the Fed does, let's not discount the importance of that in setting terms that can make clean energy financing affordable in this country, but it's even more of an issue in countries around the world where financing is even more expensive than it is in the United States.
Another question in the audience? Yeah. Can you pass the microphone now?
So I work at the intersection of innovation and industry, trying to take startups and get them closer to industry to scale faster. So taking Trump out of the picture, because he's just, even pre-Trump, with the boom in AI and data center computing, and I know MIT addresses this a lot, it just seems like the numbers are not even moving in the right direction globally. And nations are not. I mean, I don't go to the MITEI energy conferences anymore, but so I'm not up on all the numbers. But what I have seen anecdotally is that we collectively across all countries are not moving in the right direction, and this phenomenon around using generative AI and large language models is really exacerbating the problem. Though there is value in using generative AI to solve a lot of decarbonization problems, which this institute here, this building here, talks to you about. So I wonder if you can comment on that. Do you see that in your discussions with other policy leaders and advocates?
So the way that I would frame it is I actually do think if you look at this over 15, 20 years, I actually think we're moving in the right direction, just not nearly fast enough. So I'll give you an example. I was chatting with someone here right before that. When you went back to 2008, and you look at where the models were suggesting based on policy warming would take place, it was between 4 and 5 degrees centigrade, right? When you look at what current policies around the world suggest we're going to do now, it's somewhere between 2.7 and 3.2, 3.5 degrees, right? So it is starting to move in the right direction, but far from the 1.5, 1.8 that we need to get to, right? 1.5 ultimately. And so there has been some progress. I'll give another kind of example is, in China, right? When I started working in China in 2000, the early mid-2000s, couldn't even talk about climate, you could talk about energy efficiency, right? Today, we're talking about not just when Chinese emissions will peak, but at what level, for how long, and what the kind of how quickly they'll decline, right? And so there is, in my mind, a shift, a real shift in the conversation in key countries. You look at what's happening in the EU, even after, the Ukraine war and kind of the LNG crisis, they did not back away from their clean energy commitments, right? They're about to embrace potentially a 90% reduction below 1990 levels by 2040, right? So there are commitments, there are policies, there's some progress. The problem is it's just not nearly fast enough. And I think that, to me, is kind of how I see the challenge. The AI piece is important, but there's kind of a few different things that I think are creating greater demand growth of electricity in this country or many countries around the world. It is first about increased manufacturing investments. It is about electrification, and then it is about AI. And so even in the United States, the AI signal in load growth is maybe 30% of what we're seeing in terms of growth to 2030. A lot of it is also through just EVs, heat pumps, creating more demand. And then the question is, what do we do in response to that demand? And that is where, at least I believe, that many of these hyperscalers, what they want is deliverability of electricity in the near term that they can count on more than cost. So to me, if clean energy can be permitted quickly and brought online, they'll buy that. And oftentimes that's comparable in cost to new natural gas. And so I think the AI question, it's unclear which way it's going to cut. There is a risk, I think you're right, that it could lead to more natural gas build-out in this country. But if, with the right permitting environment, it could actually unlock more clean. And that is an open question in my mind, and one that we should stay focused on.
Do we have any questions from a student? Maybe. Yeah, here we go. Student. Yeah?
Hi. First off, thanks so much for the talk and the discussion. My name is Justin Cole. I'm an undergrad studying 112, Climate Science and Engineering. So I work in the glaciology group for some of my research, and I'm curious what your read of a lot of Trump administration rhetoric and action right now around Arctic resources is. Recently, America purchased, I think it was 48 icebreakers from Finland. There's a lot of conversation about unleashing American, fossil fuel and resource extraction. Do you think this is more bluster, or this is something that could be really achievable within the goals of this administration?
The big push. I'm less clear about the oil and gas exploitation, but I think critical minerals, deep seabed mining, like this is a big issue, right? And it is critical minerals both for defense and for energy, right? hugely important, and we know that at the moment, the dependence on Chinese value chains for these critical minerals, particularly on the processing side, is seen as a huge vulnerability, irrespective of whether you're Biden or Trump. So I think there's a real problem statement here that that the U.S. needs to kind of tackle. Whether the Arctic, whether the deep seabed is the most effective way to do that, I have huge doubts whether that's the right way to do that. I think first of all, just a couple of quick broader comments. I do think that the demand projections tend to be a little bit overinflated. They don't assume efficiency improvements, substitution, reuse that could actually shave a lot of those demand projections, and then whether those can be procured from perhaps easier places to access and done in a more responsible way. In my mind, there is more opportunity to do that than to be, out there, purchasing Greenland or Canada or whatever else.
Awesome, thank you.
Is being talked about. Yeah. Well, what do you think? I mean, you're studying this stuff. Do you feel? Is the Arctic an important place for sourcing these minerals?
So I know less about the critical minerals side, specifically with respect to geographically where they're the most reserves of things that are most in demand. So before I came to MIT, I was in the Air Force Space community for about 9 years, and I more have concerns about the Canadians that I used to work with, or my friends who have worked at the radar up in Greenland, and the ways that defense policy is starting to shift. I would also prefer that we do something that is less resource and money intensive. Maybe work some kind of diplomatic relations to find resources elsewhere. It's got to be lower hanging fruit.
The one other thing I would say is that when you look at the rhetoric of the Trump administration around oil and gas, there is a real disconnect between the drill, baby, drill and opening up all these areas and what even the oil and gas industry wants, right? They want a high price. They want a stable environment, and with oil prices falling, and are they really going to opening up all these these kind of high risk environments for more exploration? It's not clear to me that's going to happen. One of the things that people don't realize is that under Trump, clean energy investments increased dramatically. Under Biden, oil and gas production increased faster than it did under Trump. Somewhat counterintuitive, but true, right? So the point being, yes, policy matters, but ultimately markets and pricing and corporate investments determine what actually happens.
Thank you.
Maybe I'll just make a comment. I went to the CERA Week, which is the big conference of the oil and gas companies mostly, also utilities and other people too. And it was very interesting. One of the oil and gas executives started out, said, we're very pleased to have a friend in the White House. It's really great. But then the second half of his talk was all about, but it'd be really nice if we had a stable investment environment and knew what the prices would really be so we could make investment decisions. Because when we make a decision, we usually don't get the return until 10, 15 years out. And he says, with the way our politics works, I have no idea what the situation is going to be 10 or 15 years from now. So it makes it pretty risky to make any big investment at all. So actually, it was very interesting. The talk started as if it was a homage to our president, and then the body of the talk was actually how really the current policy is really nuts, and it's making it very difficult for the oil and gas industry. And I think it's also making it super difficult for the clean energy industry. Though, interestingly, if you go to Texas, they build them both like crazy, right? Because the regulatory regime is easier, they don't have zoning, it's like they have a lot of experience doing big energy projects there, and they have a efficient permitting process because they do it all the time. And so it was very interesting, again, as the market rules, that's the way Texas goes, primarily.
Yeah.
And there we see is you get a mix, because you get some places have more of this resource, some of that, a certain balance makes the grid most stable, and It's very, very curious. But most places in the world, it's not like that. And the decisions of the big investors and the decisions of the policymakers have a lot to say what happens.
Texas is the state with the largest amount of wind generation. And to your earlier point, you probably know this, but Liberty Energy, the company that Chris Wright used to run, because of the tariffs, because of the price of gas, natural gas, I believe this was a couple of weeks ago, the actual market capitalization of Liberty Energy had gone down 30%, right? So a lot of what's happening actually is counterintuitively not in the interest, right?
Yeah.
When oil prices go below $60 a barrel,
You're in trouble. Yeah.
these companies start losing money.
Sorry, question in the back?
I have a very simple question. Like, what can we do as just regular people?
Yeah.
What is like the number one thing we can do? Or number 1, 2, 3? Very bare bones.
I would, so again, I think that never underestimate the voice of people in local and state, or even in members of Congress. Like picking up the phone and call. Now, yes, Cambridge is not much, reflects much of America. It's about as blue as it gets. But where people here might have connections, or students that live in other states, getting your family, getting your friends, like making a call to your state rep on policy, making your call to a member of Congress. Like people don't appreciate sometimes how receptive and responsive elected officials are to that kind of connection. And so finding out if you're from Pennsylvania, or you're from New Mexico or whatever, what's happening there at the state level, who is your member of Congress, what can you do? Like it matters, right? That is, and we as an organization can have a lot of resources of different states and what's kind of in play and what would be helpful, both at the state level and at the federal level, that we'd be happy to share with people. Those things do matter, but I think that particularly if you live in a state where it would be important for people to hear from those voices, it matters. I'll tell you, you all have read in the papers when members of Congress go back and if their town halls are unruly, like that actually carries over into Washington. It affects how people think. Those things matter. For those that are feeling more outraged, I do think the public protests matter, right? And we're beginning to see that resistance. It changes the conversation. It constrains some of the worst excesses of what happens, right? So that helps. Those are, and obviously getting connected to organizations that can help chat, like my organization is one, but there are many really good organizations that are trying to do a better job of kind of engaging the public. One of the tough things that's happened in the past 10, 15 years is that the fragmented media ecosystem has meant that the ability to kind of engage the public on issues and kind of animate and work together is much more complicated today than it was 10, 15 years ago. And I don't think the environmental movement, quite honestly, is still figuring out how to operate effectively and have that presence. Because, like NRDC was founded in 1970. Earth Day 1970, 20 million people were on the streets. That was 10% of the American public at that time. It led to almost unanimous votes in Congress for the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act. The council, like the amount of incredible bipartisan support for the environment was a direct outgrowth of that ability to get people to care and to go on the streets. And I think to some extent, if we really want to shift the conversation again, we have to figure out how to recreate that moment.
All right, well, we've come to the end of our time, and I hope we can indeed recreate that moment. So thank you again, Manish.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you all.
And I have a present here for you. I wanted to...
Do you want me to open it here?
no, that's right. Sorry, it's up to you.
I wasn't sure.
I want to let everybody know there's refreshments downstairs near the entrance to the building. We have a speaker coming next week, May 7th. Emily Carter, former head of the energy program at Princeton, leader of the plasma project at Princeton, former provost of UCLA, former dean of engineering at Princeton. She'll be coming to give a talk about if we can't get the energy transition to happen fast enough, what else can we do? So I hope you'll come for that talk, also in this building, same room. And also we have a podcast, What If It Works? If you use this QR code, you can get to our podcast. Some people in this room actually have I'm grateful for their participation in the podcast. There's quite a lot of really good talks, and I think you'll enjoy hearing some of the same themes that we talked about today. And thank you again, Manish.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you all.